talk about the wrestling club, you've also been able to bring your love and share your love of pro wrestling to these students.
Yeah.
Um, wh- tell me about how you're able to use lessons from pro wrestling and apply them to teaching.
So years ago when I taught middle school, I remember a lot of our students were really struggling with writing. It was just something that was very difficult for a lot of them to grasp. And I struggled with teaching it at times because with teachers, especially you see this with math teachers more, they know the subject so well, especially with numbers and things, but it's hard for them to get that across to students. I was just talking to some students the other day, and they were in my class saying how they didn't like this one teacher because he didn't teach them correctly. And I said, well, I didn't even know what they were talking about. I said, it's math, right? And they said, yeah. And I said, math teachers general, as a general rule of trade, some of them struggle with getting the content across because they know it so well. They just are in that mindset that others learn like them and know that, you know, stuff too. And for me with writing, it was kind of the same way. It's like, how do I get this across to my kids so they can be better writers rather, other than doing it for them, which I didn't want to do. I wanted it to have their own flair to it. So it was difficult, but incorporating things like pro wrestling not only got some kids who didn't want to write, it got a lot of kids to read. I here in town one day I was going through Burger King to pick up a burger for my dog, and when we got home there was a bunch of napkins with writing on them. I'm like, what is this? And it was a note from a guy who worked there who I had as a seventh grader. And on there he talked about me talking about wrestling and how it got him to start reading, and now he reads 2 or 3 books a month. And he never had picked up a book till he had my seventh grade class. And I have no idea the lesson he was talking about. I don't remember it, but just things like that. It's like I had an impact on this guy. He's 27 years old now, and he still remembers being 12 years old when I taught that lesson. And I have the same memories about teachers from when I was a kid that had certain lessons. And I remember I'll run into them occasionally and I'll tell them about those lessons. They have no idea what I'm talking about. And I get it. When you're doing it every day, 7 classes a day, it all comes together. So you just don't remember.
When you're teaching now, has there been do you have like a recent example of something that you've used to kind of correlate pro wrestling with in class?
So I have used my book. The first book I used to try to kind of motivate some students because, especially at the high school level, I get a lot of male students who just aren't motivated. They go to their shop class and that's what they enjoy, and they're like, well, I don't need to know this English stuff, or I don't need to know, characterization and all the traits from this book. So I try to relate some of the stories that they're reading. I'm trying to remember, like they were reading To Kill a Mockingbird. That's a tough book to try to relate to pro
It is.
wrestling, but it can be done. I talked about when Big E or when Kofi Kingston won the title at WrestleMania 35, just how that kind of bridged the racial gap and because I tell them, I was there in New York that night and I look over and there's a guy crying. And I looked at him, I said, dude, what are you crying for? He goes, this is the first time a guy that looks like me has carried this title. And I'm like, wow, that is, powerful. So I always talk about that when we talk about racial relations. And some of the kids get a kick out of that. You can break everything down to pro wrestling. And I'm like, in a sense, you can, because pro wrestling imitates real life. If it's a great story, it imitates real life.